Captain Sarah Chen had always believed that the most dangerous part of her job wasn't the enemy missiles or the hostile territory. It was the 20 minutes before dawn, when the world seemed to hold its breath. She stood on the tarmac at Alley, Dafra Air Base, watching her ground crew perform the final checks on her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The desert air was still cool, but she could already feel the heat building on the horizon where the sun would soon emerge. Sarah had been flying combat missions for 8 years, but this morning felt different. Intelligence reports had been coming, in all week, about increased enemy activity in the northern sectors. Surface-to-air missile sites were being moved around like chess pieces, and radar installations were popping up in places they'd never been before. The enemy was adapting, learning, becoming more sophisticated with each passing month. She pulled on her helmet and ran through her mental checklist one more time. Today's mission was supposed to be routine reconnaissance, fly over the disputed territory, gather intelligence, and return home in time for lunch. The weather was perfect, visibility unlimited, and her aircraft was performing flawlessly during pre-flight checks. Everything looked good on paper. Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, walked up beside her, his own helmet tucked under his arm. They'd flown together for 2 years, and she could read his expressions like a book. Today he looked concerned. "You see the updated threat assessment?" Marcus asked, his voice low enough that the ground crew couldn't hear. Sarah nodded. The intelligence briefing had been sobering. New missile systems had been detected in their target area, advanced surface-to-air missiles with longer range and better tracking capabilities than anything they'd encountered before. The enemy wasn't just defending anymore. They were hunting. Command. "Thinks it might be a bluff," she replied, checking her watch. "New equipment doesn't necessarily mean they know how to use it effectively." Marcus didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. They both knew that underestimating the enemy was how good pilots ended up as statistics. In this business, overconfidence was just another word for dead. The mission briefing had been thorough but routine. Fly north, photograph suspected weapon. Installations, monitor radio communications, and return to base. Standard reconnaissance protocols. Stay high, stay fast, and avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. Sarah had flown hundreds of similar missions without incident. She climbed into her cockpit as the eastern horizon began to glow with the first hints of sunrise. The familiar routine of strapping in, connecting systems, and running through startup procedures had become second nature. Her hands moved across the controls automatically while her mind focused on the mission ahead. The F-16's engine roared to life with a sound that never failed to thrill her. 29,000 pounds of thrust at her fingertips, capable of pushing her through the air at twice the speed of sound. The aircraft was an extension of her will, responding to her thoughts as much as her hands. Ground control cleared them for takeoff, and Sarah taxied into position behind Marcus. The runway stretched out ahead of them, disappearing into the desert haze. She advanced the throttle, felt the familiar push against her back as the afterburner kicked in, and lifted off into the growing light of dawn. Climbing through 10,000 feet, Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. This was where she belonged, alone with her machine, high above the complications of the ground. Up here, everything was simple. Physics and training were all that mattered. The flight north was uneventful. Desert landscape rolled beneath them, broken occasionally by roads or small settlements. Their target area was a remote valley where satellite imagery had detected unusual activity. New buildings, vehicle tracks, and what appeared to be radar installations. As they approached the reconnaissance zone, Sarah began her camera runs. The sophisticated equipment in her aircraft could photograph individual buildings from 30,000 feet, recording details that would be analyzed by intelligence specialists back at base. She flew precise patterns, ensuring complete coverage of the target area. It was Marcus who first noticed something was wrong. "Eagle 2, you seeing what I'm seeing on your threat display?" His voice crackled through her headset. Sarah glanced at her instruments and felt her stomach tighten. Multiple radar signatures were painting them from below, more than the intelligence briefing had suggested. Much more. The valley was bristling with detection equipment, all of it focused on their aircraft. "Eagle 1, I count at least 12. Separate radar contacts, she reported. This doesn't match our intelligence. Confirmed, Marcus replied. Recommend we climb to maximum altitude and complete the photo run from there. Sarah was already pulling back on the stick, climbing toward the aircraft's service ceiling. At 40,000 feet, they should be safe from most ground-based threats. Should be. But the radar contacts were still tracking them, still painting them with targeting signals. The mission was supposed to be routine, but Sarah could feel the hair on the back of her neck standing up. Something was very wrong in that valley. The enemy hadn't just moved equipment around, they'd set a trap. She completed her photo runs with professional efficiency, but her eyes kept returning to the threat display. The radar signatures were stronger than anything they'd encountered before, and they seemed to be coordinating their tracking. This wasn't random placement of defensive systems. This was a carefully planned ambush. Eagle flight. This is control. How's your fuel state? Sarah checked her gauges. They had enough fuel for another hour of flying, plenty to complete the mission and return to base. But the primitive part of her brain that had kept her alive through 8 years of combat flying was screaming at her to leave. Now. Control Eagle 1. Fuel is good, but we're seeing significantly more ground activity than briefed. Request permission to cut the mission short and return to base. There was a pause before Control responded. Negative, Eagle 1. Complete your assigned routes. Intelligence needs full coverage of that valley. Sarah exchanged glances with Marcus, even though he was flying 2 miles away. She could imagine his expression, the same mixture of professional duty and personal concern that she was feeling. Orders were orders, but dead pilots completed 0 missions. She banked into her final photo run, cameras recording everything below. Whatever was happening in that valley, at least they would have documentation. The intelligence analysts would have plenty to study. That's when her threat warning system exploded into urgent beeping and her world changed forever. The missile warning tone cut through Sarah's concentration like a knife. Her training kicked in before conscious thought could process what was happening. She broke hard left, pulling 7 Gs as her F-16 screamed through the thin air at 40,000 feet. The horizon spun wildly outside her canopy as she executed a diving turn that would have killed an untrained person. Missile launch. Multiple launches. Marcus's voice was tight with controlled panic. I count 4. No, 6 missiles inbound. Sarah's heads-up display was painting targets faster than she could count them. Surface-to-air missiles were climbing toward them from multiple locations throughout the valley. These weren't the old, slow systems they'd faced before. These missiles were fast, sophisticated, and they were tracking perfectly despite her evasive maneuvers. She reached for her electronic countermeasures panel, fingers dancing across switches that should have activated her defensive systems. Chaff. Dispensers that would create false radar targets. Flares that would confuse heat-seeking missiles. Electronic jammers that would blind enemy radar. All the technology that stood between her and death. Nothing happened. Eagle 1, deploy countermeasures. Control's voice crackled through her radio, but Sarah was already trying everything she knew. Negative effect on ECM, she reported. Her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Chaff dispensers not responding, flare system not responding. Electronic jamming suite appears to be completely offline. She tried the backup systems. Still nothing. Her most advanced defensive technologies, the electronic shields that modern combat aircraft depended on, had failed completely. She was flying a multi-million-dollar fighter jet that had suddenly become as vulnerable as a civilian aircraft. The first missile passed close enough that she could see its exhaust trail. Too close. Her violent maneuvering had caused it to lose lock, but barely. 5 more were still climbing, their radar guidance systems tracking her every move. Marcus, status on your defensive systems? Same as you, he replied grimly. Everything. Electronic is dead. It's like someone flipped a switch. Sarah's mind raced as she continued her evasive flying. Electronic warfare was an evolving battlefield, and apparently, the enemy had developed new capabilities, some kind of jamming system that could disable aircraft defensive electronics without affecting flight controls or basic navigation. It was sophisticated beyond anything in the intelligence reports. She rolled inverted and pulled through another, crushing turn, watching missiles adjust their flight paths to follow her. Without electronic countermeasures, she had only two defenses: her flying skills and the laws of physics. The missiles were fast, but they had limited fuel and turning capability. If she could force them to make too many sharp turns, they would run out of energy and fall from the sky. The problem was that there were 6 of them, launched from different locations, and they didn't all have to maneuver at the same time. While she was dodging one missile, others could be positioning themselves for better shots. Eagle Flight, this is Control. What's your status? Control, we have multiple missiles inbound and complete failure of defensive electronics, Sarah reported, while throwing her aircraft into another punishing turn. Attempting manual evasion, but we need immediate support. Understood, Eagle Flight. Wild Weasel flights are being scrambled to suppress those missile sites. Hold on. Easy to, say from a comfortable chair on the ground. Sarah was pulling G's that made her vision gray at the edges, fighting to stay conscious while missiles that cost more than most people's houses tried to kill her. And the nearest help was at least 20 minutes away. She watched her fuel gauge, with growing concern. High-G maneuvering consumed fuel at an enormous rate, and she'd been turning and burning for 5 minutes straight. At this rate, she'd be running on fumes long before the cavalry arrived. Another missile passed close enough to rattle her teeth. Its proximity fuse had nearly triggered. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that manual evasion alone wasn't going to save her. She needed to think like the enemy, predict their tactics, and use their own sophistication against them. The missiles were using radar guidance, tracking her aircraft by bouncing signals off its metal surfaces. But radar had limitations. It could be confused by terrain, fooled by unexpected maneuvers, and disrupted by interference from other sources. Sarah looked down at the rugged valley below. Rocky ridges, deep canyons, and uneven terrain that could mask radar signatures. It was dangerous to fly that low. One mistake would turn her into a smoking crater, but it might be her only chance. Marcus, I'm going low. Follow my lead, but stay high enough to provide backup if I don't make it. Sarah, that terrain will kill you faster than the missiles. Maybe. But the missiles will definitely kill me if I stay up here. She pushed her stick forward and dove toward the valley floor, her altimeter unwinding like a broken clock. 20,000 feet. 15,000. 10,000. The ground rushed toward her at speeds that made rational thought impossible. At 5,000 feet above the valley floor, she pulled out of the dive and began flying nap of the earth, following the terrain contours at altitudes that would have terrified her instructor pilots. Her aircraft was designed for this kind of flying, but not while being chased by guided missiles. The rocky ridges and deep canyons worked as she'd hoped. 2 missiles lost lock and exploded harmlessly against cliff faces when their guidance systems couldn't distinguish her aircraft from the surrounding rock. But 3 others adapted, continuing to track her even through the terrain masking. Sarah flew through canyons so narrow that her wingtips almost touched the walls. She followed riverbeds and hugged hillsides, using every feature of the landscape to break radar lock. Her altimeter readings fluctuated wildly as she climbed and dove with the terrain, sometimes flying only 100 feet above the ground, sometimes ducking below the rim of canyons entirely. The stress was enormous. Flying this low required split-second reactions and perfect aircraft control. One moment of inattention, one small mistake, and she would join the wreckage of other pilots who had tried to cheat death among the rocks and ravines. But it was working. The missiles were designed to engage aircraft flying predictable courses at high altitude. Down here in the weeds, following terrain that changed every second, their sophisticated guidance systems were struggling to maintain lock. She watched the last missile run out of fuel and crash into a hillside, its warhead exploding harmlessly against solid rock. For the first time in 10 minutes, her threat warning system was silent. Eagle 1, status report, Control called. Sarah checked her instruments, hardly believing she was still alive. Control, immediate missile threat is neutralized, all defensive. Electronics still offline. Fuel state is critical. I need to head home immediately. She climbed back to altitude, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. The mission was over, but her problems were just beginning. Without electronic defenses, the flight home would be just as dangerous as the target area, and somewhere below, enemy technicians were probably already preparing to launch more missiles. As she turned toward home, Sarah realized that everything had changed. The rules of aerial warfare had shifted, and pilots could no longer depend on technology to keep them alive. The sky had become a much more dangerous place, and only the most skilled pilots were going to survive what was coming next. The flight home should have been the easy part. Sarah had survived the missile attack, escaped the valley, and was pointing her F-16 toward friendly territory. Her fuel gauge showed enough for a careful return to base, and the immediate threats were behind her. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt more vulnerable than ever. Without her electronic defensive systems, Sarah was flying blind through hostile airspace. Every radar contact could be an enemy fighter. Every radio transmission might be directing missiles toward her position. The sophisticated threat warning systems that normally provided early warning of danger were silent and useless. Eagle 2, close up on me, she called to Marcus. We're going to fly this one old school. Marcus moved his F-16 into close formation, the two aircraft flying as a team the way pilots had done for decades before computers took over much of the work. They would watch each other's backs, share visual scanning responsibilities, and rely on their eyes and instincts instead of electronic sensors. The landscape below them had changed from the rocky valleys of the target area to rolling hills and scattered settlements. Peaceful-looking farmland stretched to the horizon, but Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving. Enemy forces could be hidden anywhere, and without her threat warning systems, she wouldn't know about danger until it was too late. Her radio crackled with transmissions from base operations, other aircraft, and ground control stations. Normally, her aircraft's computer systems would filter these communications, highlighting important messages and storing others for later review. Now, she had to monitor everything manually, listening for threats while trying to concentrate on flying. Eagle Flight, this is Overlord. Be advised, we're tracking multiple radar contacts moving in your direction. Vectors unknown. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Radar contacts could be anything: civilian aircraft, friendly patrols, or enemy fighters, positioning for an attack. Without her identification systems working, she had no way to tell the difference until she could see them visually. Overlord Eagle 1. Request vector to nearest friendly forces. Eagle 1. Friendly forces are scattered throughout your route. Recommend you maintain current heading and altitude. Wild weasel flights are engaging ground targets in your former area. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge again. The needle was moving toward empty faster than she liked. Her violent maneuvering during the missile attack had consumed fuel at an enormous rate, and now she was calculating whether she had enough to make it home. The math was close. Too close. She could request an aerial refueling, but that would require her to rendezvous with a tanker aircraft, and without working navigation systems, that coordination would be difficult and dangerous. Better to press on and hope her fuel calculations were accurate. Contact 2 o'clock high, Marcus called out. I've got aircraft moving toward us. Sarah squinted through her canopy in the direction Marcus indicated. There, 2 dark specks against the blue sky, too far away to identify but definitely heading their way. In normal circumstances, her radar would have identified them already, providing range, speed, and identification information. Now she had to rely on her Mark I eyeball and hope they were friendly. The aircraft grew larger as they approached. Sarah could make out delta wing configurations, swept-back wings that suggested high-performance fighters. Could be friendly, F-16s like theirs, or could be enemy aircraft with similar designs. At this distance, visual identification was nearly impossible. Eagle Flight, Overlord. Those contacts appear to be friendly, but we can't confirm without transponder signals. Transponder signals that her damaged electronics couldn't receive anyway. Sarah made a command decision. Eagle 2, let's climb to 30,000 and increase speed. If they're hostile, we'll make them work for it. The 2 F-16s climbed rapidly, their engines consuming precious fuel, but buying them altitude and energy that could be converted to survival if the approaching aircraft turned out to be enemies. Sarah kept her eyes on the distant contacts, watching for any sign of hostile intent. The aircraft passed below them without turning to engage, continuing on whatever mission had brought them into the area. Sarah exhaled slowly, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. Every contact from now until she reached friendly territory would be a roll of the dice. Her fuel situation was becoming critical. The gauge showed less than 1,000 pounds remaining, enough for perhaps 15 minutes of flight at current consumption rates. Home base was still 12 minutes away if everything went perfectly, but nothing had gone perfectly today. Eagle. 1 Overlord. You're cleared for straight-in approach, runway 27. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Emergency vehicles. That meant base operations expected trouble. Sarah wondered what they knew that she didn't, or if they were simply being cautious after her report of electronic system failures. She could see the airbase now, a collection of buildings and runways, shimmering in the desert heat. So close, but her fuel warning light was blinking red. She was literally flying on fumes, and any deviation from a perfect approach would leave her walking home from a smoking crater. Marcus, I'm going straight in. Cover me until I'm on the ground. Copy that. I've got enough fuel for a go-around, if needed. Sarah lined up with the runway, fighting to keep her approach stable as her engine began showing signs of fuel starvation. The F-16 was designed to glide reasonably well without power, but landing a powerless fighter aircraft required precision that left no room for error. The runway numbers grew larger in her windscreen. She was committed now, too low and too slow, to attempt anything except a landing. Her engine coughed once, twice, then settled back to steady power. The fuel pumps were struggling to find anything left in her tanks. She crossed the runway threshold with her fuel quantity reading 0. The landing was harder than she would have liked, but her aircraft rolled to a stop on the concrete. Only after she'd shut down her engine did she realize how much she was shaking. Ground crews swarmed her aircraft as she climbed out of the cockpit, their faces showing a mixture of relief and curiosity. She'd been gone less than 4 hours, but the debriefing would take much longer. Captain Chen, the base commander, was jogging toward her across the hot tarmac. Are you injured? What happened to your electronics? Sarah pulled off her helmet, feeling the desert sun on her face. She was alive. Her aircraft was intact, and she'd brought back intelligence that could save other pilots' lives. But she knew that this mission had changed something fundamental about how they would fight this war. Sir, we have a problem, she said. The enemy has developed electronic warfare capabilities that can disable our defensive systems completely. Every pilot needs to know about this immediately. The commander's face went pale as the implications sank in. If the enemy could neutralize their most advanced defensive technologies, every mission would become exponentially more dangerous. Pilots would have to relearn skills that had been considered obsolete, flying and fighting with their eyes and instincts instead of computer assistance. As Sarah walked toward the debriefing room, she could hear Marcus's F-16 landing behind her. They'd both survived, but she wondered how many other pilots would be so fortunate when they encountered this new threat. The war had just become much more personal and much more deadly. The age of push-button warfare was ending. The age of the pilot was beginning again. The debriefing room felt stifling after the open cockpit of her F-16. Sarah sat across from a panel of senior officers, intelligence analysts, and technical specialists, all of them hanging on her every word as she described the complete failure of her defensive electronics. Maps covered the walls marked with red circles indicating enemy positions and blue arrows showing flight paths. Tell us again about the exact sequence of system failures, said Colonel Martinez, the wing commander. His weathered face showed the strain of a man who was realizing that everything he thought he knew about air warfare had just changed. Sarah walked them through it step by step. Normal takeoff, routine flight to target area, first signs of trouble, when they detected more radar signatures than expected, then complete electronic warfare system failure just as the missiles launched. No chaff, no flares, no jamming capability, nothing but her flying skills and luck. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, she explained. They waited until we were in the most vulnerable position, high altitude, straight and level flight, maximum exposure to their missile systems. Then they activated whatever weapon disabled our electronics. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the base's senior technical analyst, looked up from her notes. She was a civilian contractor who understood aircraft electronics better than most pilots understood flying. Captain Chen, you mentioned that your flight controls and basic navigation remained functional throughout the incident? Correct. Engine, flight controls, basic radio, and primary flight instruments all worked normally. It was only the defensive countermeasures and threat warning systems that failed. Dr. Warren exchanged glances with her colleagues. That suggests a very sophisticated electronic attack. Something that could selectively target specific frequencies and systems without disrupting others. This level of precision would require detailed knowledge of our aircraft's electronic architecture. The implications were disturbing. Either the enemy had developed incredibly advanced electronic warfare capabilities on their own, or they had obtained detailed technical information about American fighter aircraft. Neither possibility was comforting. Captain, what about your wingman's aircraft? Asked Major Thompson from intelligence. Did Lieutenant Rodriguez experience identical system failures? Identical timing, identical systems affected? Whatever. Hit us was broad spectrum enough to affect both aircraft simultaneously, despite the fact that we were flying several miles apart. Sarah could see the worry in their faces. If enemy forces could disable the electronic defenses of multiple aircraft over a wide area, every mission would become a suicide run. Modern fighter aircraft depended on their electronic systems the way a shark depended on its senses. Without them, they were nearly helpless. Colonel Martinez leaned forward. Captain, in your professional opinion, how do we adapt to this threat? It was the question Sarah had been dreading, because she wasn't sure there was a good answer. Sir, we need to go back to basics. Visual identification, manual flying skills, and tactical techniques that don't depend on electronic systems. Essentially, we need to fight this war the way pilots fought in the 1970s and 1980s. But our current pilots weren't trained for that kind of warfare, objected Major Chen, the training officer. Most of our pilots have never flown a combat mission without electronic assistance. Sarah nodded grimly. She'd been thinking about this during the flight home. Then we need to retrain them, and fast. Every pilot in this wing needs to learn how to fight manually, how to identify threats visually, and how to survive without computer assistance. Dr. Warren spoke up again. There might be technical solutions as well. If we understand how their electronic attack works, we might be able to develop countermeasures or harden our systems against it. How long would that take? Colonel Martinez asked. Months at minimum. Possibly years depending on the sophistication of their weapon. We don't have years, the colonel replied sharply. We have missions to fly next week. The room fell silent as the reality sank in. They were facing an enemy who had achieved a technological breakthrough that could neutralize America's most advanced weapon systems, and their only immediate response was to go backward in technology and tactics. Sarah cleared her throat. Sir, I recommend we implement immediate changes to our mission planning and execution. Fly lower to avoid radar detection. Use terrain masking whenever possible. Reduce predictable flight patterns. And most importantly, train every pilot in manual evasion techniques. Manual evasion? Major Thompson looked puzzled. Flying by instinct and visual reference instead of relying on electronic threat warnings. It's harder, more dangerous, and requires skills that most current pilots don't have. But it's the only way to survive if our electronics are compromised. Colonel Martinez stood up and began pacing behind his chair. Captain Chen, I want you to develop a training program. Work with our most experienced pilots to create scenarios that simulate complete electronic warfare system failure. We need every pilot in this wing ready to fly and fight manually within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was being asked to compress decades of flying experience into a crash course that could mean the difference between life and death for her fellow pilots. Yes, sir. I'll need access to the simulator facility and permission to modify our standard training protocols. Done. Dr. Warren, I want your technical team working around the clock to understand this electronic attack. Tear apart every piece of equipment that was aboard Captain Chen's aircraft. Find out how they did this and how we can stop it. Colonel will also need to warn other units, Sarah added. If this capability is being used against us, it's probably being used against other squadrons as well. The colonel's face was grim. Already taken care of. Every airbase in the theater is getting the warning along with your after-action report. But warnings aren't enough. We need solutions. As the meeting broke up, Dr. Warren approached Sarah. Captain, I'd like to examine your aircraft personally. Sometimes pilots notice things that don't show up in electronic diagnostics. They walked out to the flight line together, where Sarah's F-16 sat in a maintenance hangar surrounded by technicians. The aircraft looked normal from the outside. No visible damage, no obvious signs of the electronic warfare attack that had nearly killed her. The strangest thing was how sudden it was, Sarah told Dr. Warren as they examined the aircraft's exterior. One moment everything was working normally, the next moment everything was dead. No gradual degradation, no partial failures. Just instant, complete system shutdown. Dr. Warren nodded, making notes on a tablet computer. That suggests either a very powerful electromagnetic pulse or some kind of virus-like attack that could propagate through the aircraft's computer networks. A virus in a fighter aircraft? Modern military aircraft are essentially flying computers. If someone understood our software architecture well enough, they might be able to introduce malicious code that could disable specific systems on command, the CIA thought was terrifying. If enemy forces could hack into American fighter aircraft and disable their defenses remotely, no pilot would be safe anywhere in the world. As they continued their examination, Sarah realized that her close encounter with death was only the beginning. The enemy had changed the rules of engagement, and American pilots would have to adapt quickly or die trying. The comfortable reliance on technology was over. From now on, survival would depend on the oldest tools in aviation: skill, courage, and instinct. The war had just become much more personal and much more dangerous. The simulator building hummed with unusual activity at 0500 hours. Sarah had arrived early to prepare for what might be the most important training session of her career. 12 of the squadron's most experienced pilots would spend the next 10 days learning how to fight without the electronic systems they'd depended on for years. She stood before a bank of F-16 simulators, each one programmed with the scenario that had nearly killed her 3 days earlier. The difference was that these pilots would know what was coming. They would have the chance to practice techniques that she'd had to improvise while dodging real missiles. The first pilot to arrive was Captain Jake Morrison, a veteran with over 2,000 flight hours who'd flown combat missions in 3 different theaters. His confident swagger faltered when he saw the mission profile displayed on the briefing screen. Complete electronic warfare system failure? Jake read aloud. Sarah, that's not possible. The backup systems have backups. The whole point of redundant systems is that they don't all fail at once. That's what I thought too, Sarah replied. Right up until the moment I had 6 missiles chasing me with no way to deploy countermeasures. Other pilots filtered into the briefing room, their conversations dying as they read the mission parameters. These were experienced combat pilots who'd faced missiles, enemy fighters, and mechanical emergencies. But the idea of flying combat missions without electronic assistance clearly unsettled them. Lieutenant Rodriguez entered and nodded to Sarah. Marcus had been flying practice missions all week, trying to perfect the manual techniques they'd use to survive. His input would be crucial for the training program. Gentlemen, listen up, Sarah began once all 12 pilots were seated. What I'm about to teach you goes against everything you learned in flight school. You're going to learn to ignore your instruments and trust your instincts. You're going to learn to identify threats with your eyes instead of your radar. And you're going to learn to fly like your grandfather's generation did. Captain Morrison raised his hand. Sarah, no disrespect, but pilots in our grandfather's generation had a lot higher casualty rate than we do. There's a reason we developed all these electronic systems. You're absolutely right, Sarah acknowledged. Electronic systems make flying safer and more effective. But what happens when the enemy can turn those systems against us? What happens when the tools that were supposed to protect us become liabilities? She clicked to the next slide, showing gun camera footage from her encounter with the missiles. The pilots watched in silence as she maneuvered through the valley, dodging missiles while flying barely above the terrain. This is what manual evasion looks like, she explained. No electronic warnings, no automated countermeasures, just flying skills and terrain masking. It's dangerous, it's exhausting, and it requires perfect aircraft control. But it works. Major Stevens, the squadron's most senior pilot, studied the footage intently. Sarah, what you did in that valley, that's not standard procedure for surface-to-air missile evasion. Standard procedure doesn't work when your countermeasures are offline, Sarah replied. I had to get creative, use the terrain to break radar. Luck. It's risky, but it was the only option that gave me a chance. She spent the next hour walking them through the theory of manual evasion. How to read enemy missile behavior without electronic assistance. How to use terrain features to mask aircraft signatures. How to identify threats through visual observation alone. Most importantly, how to fly their aircraft to the limits of performance without computer assistance. The key thing to remember, she emphasized, is that you can't rely on your threat warning system to tell you when you're in danger. You have to develop situational awareness through constant visual scanning, radio communication, and understanding enemy tactics. Captain Morrison looked skeptical. Sarah, we fly at altitudes and speeds that make visual identification nearly impossible. How are we supposed to spot enemy fighters before they spot us? By changing how we fight, Sarah answered. Lower altitudes, different formations, unpredictable flight patterns. We can't fight this war the same way we fought the last one. The simulator training began that afternoon. Sarah watched as each pilot climbed into a cockpit and faced the scenario that had nearly killed her. Most of them lasted less than 2 minutes before virtual missiles found their mark. Captain Morrison's first attempt was typical. He executed perfect textbook evasive maneuvers, but without chaff and flares to confuse the missiles. His predictable patterns made him an easy target. His aircraft exploded in a spectacular fireball on the simulator's visual display. I don't understand, he said, after climbing out of the simulator. I did everything right according to the manual. The manual assumes your countermeasures work, Sarah explained. When they don't, you have to throw the manual away and improvise. She demonstrated the techniques she'd used to survive, showing how terrain masking could break radar lock, how unpredictable flight patterns could defeat missile guidance systems, and how understanding enemy tactics could provide crucial seconds of warning. Major Stevens tried next, and his performance was better. As an older pilot, he'd learned to fly before computer assistance became standard. His instincts for visual navigation and manual flight control served him well, but he still struggled with the unfamiliar tactics required for survival. This is like learning to fly all over again, he commented after his third attempt. Everything I know about air-to-air combat assumes that my electronics work. That's exactly the problem, Sarah agreed. We've become so dependent on technology that we've forgotten how to fight without it. The enemy has figured out our weakness and turned it against us. Lieutenant Rodriguez shared his own experience, describing how disorienting it had been to suddenly lose all electronic assistance while under attack. The silence was the worst part, he told the group. When your threat warning system goes quiet in the middle of a missile attack, your brain doesn't know how to process that information. Sarah nodded. Your training tells you that silence means safety. But in this new environment, silence might mean your warning systems have been compromised. You have to develop new instincts. The training continued for hours. Each pilot flew multiple scenarios, gradually improving their manual evasion techniques. Sarah watched them struggle with concepts that went against years of training. Flying low enough to use terrain masking felt wrong to pilots trained to stay high for safety. Ignoring electronic displays felt like flying blind to pilots who'd learned to trust their instruments above all else. By the end of the first day, only 3 pilots had successfully evaded the simulated missile attack. Sarah wasn't surprised. These techniques required not just new skills, but a complete change in mindset. Pilots had to overcome their reliance on technology and trust their instincts again. Captain Morrison approached her after the session ended. Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said. If the enemy can disable our electronics, what's to stop them from doing it to every aircraft in the theater? Nothing, Sarah replied honestly. That's why this training is so critical. We might be the only squadron that knows how to survive this kind of attack. If we can't train the rest of our pilots fast enough. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood the implications. American air superiority, the foundation of modern military strategy, could evaporate overnight if enemy forces could neutralize their electronic advantages. Dr. Warren arrived at the simulator facility that evening with preliminary results from her technical analysis. Her face was grim as she briefed Sarah and the other pilots. "We've identified the attack vector," she announced. "It's a sophisticated electromagnetic pulse weapon, but not like anything we've seen before. Instead of a broad-spectrum blast that would damage everything, this weapon can target specific frequency ranges with incredible precision." Major Stevens leaned forward. "You're saying they can selectively disable our countermeasures while leaving everything else functional?" "Exactly. It requires detailed knowledge of our electronic systems, what frequencies they operate on, how they're shielded, what their vulnerabilities are. This isn't something they developed in isolation. They had help." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Someone with access to classified technical specifications had provided the enemy with the information needed to build this weapon. There was a traitor somewhere in the system, and American pilots were paying the price. "How do we defend against it?" Sarah asked. Dr. Warren shook her head. "Short term, we don't. The weapon exploits fundamental characteristics of our electronic systems. Redesigning everything to resist this attack would take years and billions of dollars." "So we're back to manual techniques," Major Stevens concluded. "For now, yes. But there might be another option." Dr. Warren pulled up a technical diagram on her tablet. "If we can identify the source of these electromagnetic attacks quickly enough, we might be able to target them with conventional weapons. The pulse generators required for this kind of precision attack would be large, expensive, and difficult to hide." Sarah studied the diagram. "You're talking about counter-electronic warfare. Find their jammers and destroy them before they can disable our systems." "Exactly. But it would require split-second timing and perfect coordination between aircraft. One team would have to locate and target the electronic warfare sites while another team provided protection. It was a dangerous strategy that would require incredible skill and coordination. But it offered hope that American pilots might regain the technological advantage that had kept them alive for so many years." "Dr. Warren, how long before you can give us reliable detection methods for these pulse generators?" "A few weeks, maybe a month. But in the meantime, you'll have to continue flying missions with the assumption that your electronics could fail at any moment." Sarah looked around the room at her fellow pilots. These were some of the best combat aviators in the world, but they were facing a threat unlike anything they'd trained for. Success would require not just new tactics, but a fundamental change in how they thought about air warfare. "Gentlemen, we have a lot of work to do," she announced. "Tomorrow we start advanced manual combat techniques. By the time we're finished, you'll be able to fight and win without any electronic assistance. Because right now that might be the only thing standing between us and losing this war." 2 weeks after the first electronic warfare attack, Sarah found herself leading the most dangerous mission of her career. Intelligence had located 3 enemy electromagnetic pulse generators hidden in a mountain valley 60 miles behind enemy lines. Destroying them would restore American electronic superiority, but reaching them would require flying through the most heavily defended airspace in the theater. 8 F-16s sat on the tarmac in the pre-dawn darkness, their pilots making final preparations for a mission that could change the course of the war. These were the pilots who had mastered the manual flying techniques Sarah had taught them, the ones who could fight and survive without electronic assistance. "Remember," Sarah addressed the group during the final briefing, "assume your countermeasures will fail the moment we cross into enemy territory. Fly like your electronics don't exist because they probably won't." Captain Morrison, who had initially been skeptical of manual flying techniques, nodded grimly. After 2 weeks of intensive training, he'd become one of the most proficient manual pilots in the squadron. "Sarah, what if they hit us with that electromagnetic weapon before we reach the target? Then we complete the mission anyway," she replied. "Those pulse generators are the source of our problems. Until they're destroyed, every pilot in this theater is flying a potential death trap." The mission plan was complex but necessary. 4 aircraft would approach the valley from the north, flying low to avoid radar detection. 4 more would circle to the south, ready to provide support if the primary attack failed. Sarah would lead the northern approach, using the manual navigation, techniques they'd perfected during training. Lieutenant Rodriguez checked his watch. "Sunrise in 30 minutes. If we're going to do this, we need to launch now." Sarah looked around at her pilots one last time. These men had trained harder in the past 2 weeks than most pilots trained in a year. They'd learned to navigate by visual landmarks, identify targets without electronic assistance, and fly complex attack patterns using nothing but their eyes and instincts. "Gentlemen, let's go make history." The takeoff was routine, 8 fighters lifting into the pale dawn sky. But as they formed up and headed toward enemy territory, Sarah felt the familiar tension that preceded every dangerous mission. Today would determine whether their intensive training could overcome enemy technology. Crossing into hostile airspace, Sarah's threat warning system immediately began painting multiple radar contacts, surface-to-air missile sites, early warning radars, and what appeared to be fighter aircraft on patrol. All the electronic signatures of a heavily defended target area. "Flight, this is Eagle 1. Electronic warfare attack probable in 3 minutes. Switch to manual navigation and visual reference." The pilots acknowledged her transmission and began the procedures they'd practiced dozens of times. GPS systems were turned off in favor of map reading and visual landmarks. Threat warning displays were ignored in favor of constant visual scanning. They were essentially flying their multi-million-dollar fighters like aircraft from the 1970s. The electromagnetic attack came exactly when Sarah expected it. Her electronic displays flickered and went dark. Her threat warning system fell silent and her countermeasure dispensers became inoperative. But this time, she was ready. "Electronic warfare attack confirmed," she announced calmly. "All systems compromised. Continue with manual procedures." Flying low through the mountainous terrain, the 8 F-16s navigated by sight toward their target. Sarah led them through valleys and over ridges using terrain features she'd memorized during mission planning. Without GPS guidance, navigation required constant attention and perfect timing. "Contact. Missiles inbound from the ridgeline." Captain Morrison's voice cut through the radio static. Sarah looked up and saw the telltale smoke trails of surface-to-air missiles climbing toward their formation. 6 missiles, launched from hidden sites among the rocks. Without electronic countermeasures, they would have to evade manually. Break formation. Execute evasive pattern delta. The 8 aircraft scattered like leaves in a hurricane, each pilot implementing the manual evasion techniques they'd practiced endlessly in the simulator. Sarah dove toward the valley floor, using terrain masking to break radar lock. Behind her, she could see Morrison and Rodriguez executing similar maneuvers. One missile exploded harmlessly against a cliff face when its target disappeared behind a ridge. Another ran out of fuel after chasing Stevens through a series of sharp turns that exceeded its maneuvering capability. But 4 missiles remained active, tracking different aircraft with deadly persistence. Sarah watched Lieutenant Peterson's F-16 disappear in a fireball as a missile found its mark. The young pilot had been one of their best students, but manual evasion required split-second timing that only came with experience. His sacrifice reminded them all how dangerous this mission really was. "Eagle 7 is down," she reported grimly. "Continue to target." The remaining 7 aircraft regrouped and pressed toward the valley where intelligence reported the electromagnetic pulse generators were hidden. Sarah could see the installations now. 3 large antenna arrays surrounded by defensive positions. Destroying them would require precision bombing in the face of intense ground fire. Flight, target in sight. Execute attack pattern Bravo. The F-16 swept down into the valley in a coordinated attack that relied entirely on visual reference and manual flying skills. No laser-guided bombs, no GPS-assisted targeting, just pilot skill and iron bombs dropped the old-fashioned way. Sarah lined up her target, the largest of the 3 antenna installations, and dove toward it at an angle that would give her the best chance of a direct hit. Ground fire erupted from defensive positions, filling the air with tracers and exploding shells. She released her bombs at the exact moment her training had taught her, pulling up sharply to avoid the blast. Behind her, the antenna array disappeared in a massive explosion that sent debris flying for hundreds of yards. Morrison and Rodriguez hit the second installation with similar precision, their bombs destroying equipment that had cost the enemy millions of dollars and months of preparation. The third target fell to Stevens and Williams, their coordinated attack leaving nothing but burning wreckage. "All targets destroyed," Sarah announced. "Reform and head for home." As they climbed out of the valley, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Her electronic displays were beginning to flicker back to life. Her threat warning system emitted tentative beeps as it tried to restart. The destruction of the pulse generators had restored their electronic capabilities. "Flight. This is Eagle 1. Electronic systems coming back online. Repeat, countermeasures are functional." The relief in her pilots' voices was audible as their aircraft's defensive systems came back to life. They were no longer flying blind through hostile territory, but Sarah knew they couldn't abandon the manual techniques that had gotten them this far. The flight home was almost routine compared to the approach. With their electronic defenses functional again, they could detect and avoid threats long before they became dangerous. The missile sites that had seemed so threatening on the way in were easily avoided with proper threat warning. Back at base, Colonel Martinez was waiting on the tarmac as they landed. His face showed relief mixed with pride as he counted the returning aircraft. 7 out of 8, not perfect, but far better than anyone had expected for such a dangerous mission. "Captain Chen," he said as Sarah climbed out of her cockpit, "preliminary reports indicate that electronic warfare attacks have stopped throughout the theater. You've restored our technological advantage." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained serious. "For now, sir. But the enemy will adapt. They'll develop new weapons, new tactics, new ways to neutralize our advantages. We can't afford to become dependent on technology again." "What are you recommending?" "Continue the manual training program. Every pilot in this theater needs to know how to fight without electronic assistance, because this won't be the last time someone tries to turn our own technology against us." As she walked toward the debriefing room, Sarah reflected on what they'd accomplished. They'd proven that skilled pilots could overcome technological disadvantages through training, courage, and adaptability. But more importantly, they'd learned that the most sophisticated weapon system ever built was still only as good as the pilot flying it. The war would continue, with new threats and new challenges, but American pilots would be ready because they'd remembered the most important lesson in aviation. In the end, it's not the machine that wins the fight, it's the person flying it.